Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Leading Through a Pandemic. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Professor at London Business School. I'm the host for this entire series. This is now the 17th of the webinars in this series. Today, we are talking about leadership challenges in times of profound uncertainty. And I'm delighted to be joined by two people today. First of all, my colleague, Professor Randall Peterson, who is a Professor of Organisational Behaviour at the school and also the Academic Director of our Leadership Institute. Welcome, Randall.
Thank you, Julian. Pleasure to be here.
Perfect. Also, we have Chris Hopson, who is the Chief Executive of NHS Providers. That is the membership organisation for the UK's 217 NHS hospital trusts, the mental health, community and ambulance services, which collectively employ, I gather, about 800,000 people. And for the UK audience here, I know this is an international audience, but for the UK audience, Chris has actually become quite well known. He is a regular attendee on BBC radio and TV. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you, Julian.
Perfect. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Randall, and he can tell us a little bit about the leadership challenges we face in these times of profound uncertainty. Randall, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julian. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've been thinking about since this crisis began. And the plan here is really to have it about 1/3 each between what Chris has to say, what I have to say, and some time for questions. I'm going to start here. You know, for most of any of you who know me, you know I spend most of my time in my professional life training leaders. At London Business School and in private work that I do. And as I do this, have been doing this for quite a few years, recently I got a call from a journalist who said, I really want to know then about crisis leadership and how do I train my leaders now given the crisis that's going on. And it caused me to think a lot about what are some of the issues. And I really boiled it down to a kind of big and important effect here called threat rigidity effect. And so I quickly wrote something up with my former student and collaborator, Heidi Gardner, and it was on the Harvard Business Review blog page within a couple of days after we wrote it. And here's the kind of basic idea of it. I want to present that idea, and then we'll have Chris talk about how that looks in action in an organization, and then we'll do questions. So, of course, crisis in time of intense difficulty and danger, you feel like the world is crushing you from both sides, like that little graphic there. And that usually creates a sense of threat. And most of us have felt some form of threat through this whole situation. Threat for our work, our livelihoods, threat to our family, you know, for anybody who may get ill, and so on. And what that usually happens, what that creates in people is three things. First is thinking that's more narrow. The search for solutions tends to be restricted to what you know, what's around you, and what you know well. So we focus close by, close to home. Two, we tend to defer to leaders who give us instruction. We look upwards to know what to do next in a crisis. And three, there are very strong social pressures for collaboration. Most people are more willing to collaborate, more willing to work together and follow instruction in a crisis. Okay? So that's the psychology of what happens here. And we're now going to launch poll number 1. Just from that basic introduction, on balance, that narrow thinking, deferring to the leader, and pressure for conformity, is that number 1, helpful for organizations to survive? Number 2, problematic and unhelpful for surviving the crisis? Or 3, just a mixed bag, maybe it's sometimes helpful, sometimes not. So what do you think? When we've got the results will come up here. I'm very curious how people respond to that. All right, here we are. Okay, so most people think it's maybe a mixed bag of stuff. Fewer people saying it's clearly good and clearly bad. All right. Well, in some ways, it doesn't matter which of those three you pick because they're all correct depending upon different circumstances. So one is highlighted here with this great quote from Peter Drucker, the kind of original management guru. The greatest danger in times of turbulence is really, is to act with yesterday's logic. And he's clearly making the case here that when your circumstances have changed, you've got to forget the past and move on. So that propensity to focus on the here and now, for example, is a problem. On the other hand, from the other side, Martin Turner is a sports psychologist, pretty well-known one. The key difference between those who get the gold and those who don't is between the years. It comes down to, can you process, really think about the situation that you're in and whether these instincts you have are helpful or not helpful. And those who get that right succeed. And they succeed in a very particular way. So, for example, when we look at narrow thinking here, a couple of things to keep in mind. First, any well-practiced skill will be delivered more efficiently, more effectively in crisis. So what we find, for example, from research is that in the crunch match, professional athletes improve their performance, amateur athletes disintegrate and fall apart, right? Why? Because professional athletes' skills have been honed, they're almost automatic and super well practiced, and it's exactly what you need to win, and therefore you're more likely to win. Now, if we think about what's going on out there in the world right now, if you're, say, in the food industry, fundamentally, what you need to do is to deliver, and deliver as efficiently as possible. Your instincts in that industry, what works, are probably spot on. This is going to be helpful to you. On the other hand, if you are doing something and the situation is changed, right? You may be a professional, so you're a local GP now, and you're used to running 10-minute surgeries and meeting people, and all of a sudden you're not meeting people anymore. You're having to diagnose over Zoom and other mechanisms. This is completely different. And so the instincts of the past are probably not helpful here. And creativity and flexibility are seen as a bit risky, and that adds to the sense of threat. So if it's something that's well practiced and the situation is fundamentally doing the same, great. And if it's not, then it becomes a problem. So deferring to the leader, leaders should expect more power and greater compliance from people. In an emergency, everybody following instructions for how to get out of the theater is very helpful, okay? Followers are not likely to be sharing enough information though. And here's a really quirky example. There was a lot of publicity early on, just as the crisis was hitting, about people being irrational because they were hoarding toilet paper. Why were people hoarding all this toilet paper? And it stopped very quickly because you know what happened? A couple of guys went out and said, instead of saying, these people are irrational, we need to stop this, they said, well, let's find out why people are doing this. And it turns out, if you think about it, if you know you're going to be home 24 hours a day, you need a lot more toilet paper at home than you did before. So the problem from the manufacturer point of view is you're getting to shift more toilet paper manufacturing towards the stuff that gets used at home and less that gets used in the office. So instead of focusing on why are people irrational, there's actually a business imperative behind it if you take the time to really get in there. And people on the ground understand that. That doesn't always make it to the top of the organization. Now, followers themselves look for leader strength. And a couple of my colleagues have done this work as well, but it goes back for 15 years plus. We'll look for strength, and we'll choose strength over competence. Something needs to happen. Anything is important. We need to move and do something. And pressure for collaboration. All of us become more willing to work together. There's less public disagreement, generally. And leaders and followers are inclined to collaborate, some would argue conform to, for example, the first solution that comes along. Again, if you're in a well-practiced area and you're delivering the same thing, that's helpful. If you need to innovate, the first acceptable solution that everybody wants to just do and move on, not helpful. So with that in mind, I have some advice for leaders, have some advice for people who are, or for when you're not in a leadership role, on things you can do to actually make this work better in our current circumstance. So first, strong leaders. Leaders need to look the part. They need to be energetic and assertive and get stuff done, right? You also need to act the part in how you work with people. Leader strength is also about having consistent values. No matter where we are, they know what your top 3 priorities or values are. They can almost predict what you're going to say from what's happening right now. They'll want you to confirm it, but they'll be so clear. And they want you to be inclusive. Find out what's going on at the grassroots level. Listen to people. So you're listening as much as you are also being strong. So, crisis is now a time for opportunity as well as risk. How do you find opportunity? Well, you step up, you be active, you be strong, you be dynamic. Second, forget the past. You can't undo it. You may have had the best plan in the history of the world, but the world has moved on now. So in normal times, your focus is very much on somewhat on the future, and somewhat on now and somewhat on the past. Of course, now you need to shift much more to the right now, and also be looking into the future. You've got to have some really smart brains focused on where we can go. What are the opportunities here? Maybe even separately from. I interviewed David Pyatt yesterday, and his big insight was, he's done this before. I've interviewed him for a case study where he divides his team into those focusing on making things happen today and keeping us alive, and a separate group looking for opportunity coming out of the crisis. So people expect you to communicate often. It's impossible to communicate too much. And honestly, that doesn't mean you have to say the same thing over and over, because situations change. You may be saying something different tomorrow than today, but be honest in what you're doing. And look broadly for role models. Look outside your industry. There are a handful of leaders out there right now that have gotten a lot of attention because they're handling this really well. Even people outside of that industry can look at them and learn. So a little bit of advice for followers. That is this propensity to disagree, for example, less. And I've got a couple photos there of people with tape over their mouth. And that tape is often put over the mouth by the individuals themselves, not necessarily others. So share relevant information. If you understand what's going on at the grassroots level, on the bottom levels, and on the streets, send that information forward. Make sure people at least are exposed to it, and make sure that that's part of the discussion. Again, look outside your organization for inspiration and ideas for what you could be doing. Keeping a growth mindset. So this is an opportunity not to be so scared that we don't think more creatively. And really importantly here, ask questions about why you're being asked to do what you're doing. When you're in social isolation, why? What's behind it? That will help you make. Then it's likely to change, keep you more informed, and help you make better decisions if you really understand why, rather than just following rote what perhaps a leader is telling you. Now, all of this really comes down to this, especially when change is required. Asking questions, seeking feedback, staying in touch with what's going on throughout your organization feels like wasting time. It's not. It is really preparing for those futures rather than wasting time trying to protect kind of the outdated ways. that little graphic down in the lower right where the leader has, that scope to the future is really what it's about. Being preemptive, looking forward. It's so important to communicate confidence in a shared future that we will all have. Yes, it will be different, but it will be okay. That's what your people are looking for. And you as a leader need to communicate as clearly and consistently as possible. So a few thoughts in crisis here. Price of doing the same old thing is really higher than the price of change. And in the short term, perhaps not, but certainly in the medium to long term for most of us now. And there's no passion to be found in playing small. This is a really big crisis, but that also suggests big opportunity for most of us somewhere, if we look carefully enough. Where is that opportunity in our industry, in our business? And this is my favorite leadership graphic always. It's all about resilience. If you are the frog, it's very easy to feel like, the easiest thing to do is to just let it happen. Fight back, grab the stork's throat, pull yourself out. And yes, you're munched up a bit. Yep, you're wet and slimed by the stork. But you know what? If you can get your way out of there, you live to hop another day. And resilience is really the key to survival in this crisis for all of us. If you remember nothing else, remember that message of the importance of resilience, even when you feel beat up and slimed over. Now, I would like to launch poll number 2 here. I want to know how many of you are seeing the leaders who are really good role models, stepping up, communicating often and honestly, focusing on that shared future. Are you seeing a lot of it? Great, my organization's in great shape. I'm seeing some, but we need more. Or leadership, I'm still waiting, and we're floundering here. And really curious where most of us are at right now. Crisis has been going on for some time. So we're not in that initial stage of panic anymore. We should be in the stage of what are we doing about it? What are the things that are happening right now? And I hope your leaders are communicating in that way that we want to see them. And so part of the reason I have invited Chris along here is to talk about it from that leadership actually out there kind of perspective. So what have we got here in terms of results? Okay. So most of us are saying we've got some good examples, but we need more. And one of the basic truisms of leadership is always that we rarely see the quality of leadership, and when the tide is coming in and everything's going well, the quality of leadership is exposed when we're struggling and things are going wrong. And that seems to certainly be the case here as well. So let me stop sharing this and turn it over to Chris for some comments on that.
So thank you, Randall. That's really helpful. So what I thought I'd do is just kind of give you a sense of really 2 things. The first is just 2 or 3 observations about the sort of pressures that I feel my organisation and the wider NHS is under in terms of particular features of this crisis that seem to me to be important. And then I thought I'd just share with you a few kind of personal impressions about how I'm trying to lead my organisation, because I sometimes think actually it's useful to get a real sense of what it looks like in terms of from an individual perspective. So the 3 features I think I'd pull out are, first of all, just that real sense of, in this kind of crisis, people feel there's a real need to make quick decisions. And what you effectively feel is that pressure of time, that if you dilly-dally too long, then effectively you're going to lose the opportunity to make the decision that is needed. And I think there's a really interesting issue about how quickly you need to make decisions given that pressure of time. I think the second observation I'd make is just the scale of change. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the NHS, in our national health system over the last 8-10 weeks, it just looks completely different because we've been focusing on coronavirus, and we've, for example, created 33,000 new beds to focus on treating coronavirus patients. And actually, when you talk to the chief executives the hospital chief execs that we talk to every day, what they're saying to us is that it just that the nature of what they're trying to run at the moment feels quite different. So that real kind of sense of people who've been used to running things and running organizations that look like, let's say, a triangle. And yes, there is some stuff that is common, but they're now running organizations that actually look like a square, and therefore it feels very different. I think the third bit, which is probably more relevant to my organization, which is quite a small organization, but it's just that sense of physical and mental dislocation that comes from the entire organization working remotely. And certainly what I kind of feel is that some of the things that I'm really missing are the opportunity, for example, to have those, corridor conversations, those conversations around the water cooler. But for example, I think we pick up quite a lot about the health and well-being of our staff by the ability to be close to them and our immediate team, by being physically close to them. And I think it's much more difficult as a leader to be able to recognize where your particularly your immediate team is when you're trying to do everything on a remote basis. I find one of the things that I lose the most is that when you're trying to just do Zoom conference or video conference after video conference, is you can't quite pick up where people are in terms of their sense of health and well-being. And I think given that one of the key tasks for me as a leader is the ability to monitor and to assist and to recognize where people might be perhaps struggling a bit, that I think feels a bit more difficult in supporting and enabling people to give their best. So I thought I'd just also then kind of talk a little bit about what I'm kind of finding as a kind of leader. I think for me, the phrase that has resonated the most, which I thought was a particularly brilliant one, was that we're all in danger as senior leaders of becoming caricatures of ourselves in a crisis. That what a crisis seems to do to you as a leader is it seems to bring out the underlying bits that perhaps you weren't, that are potentially your weaknesses. So if I talk on a personal basis, I know that what I'm struggling with at the moment is, if you go back to that wonderful, for me, John Adair triangle, if as a leader, you've got to get the task done, you've got to effectively lead the individuals you're responsible for, you've got to build the team. My tendency is, when I come under pressure, is that I tend to focus on the task. And what I'm really finding at the moment is I'm really kind of probably too task focused, and I really am perhaps not getting anything like as good a balance as I should do between task, individual and team. I also think that as a leader, I kind of tend to go into detail, and I tend to obsess about the detail. And what I'm finding is, particularly because the work that we're doing is appearing on the media quite a lot, and we're issuing quite a lot of press releases, what I'm tending to find is that I'm kind of focusing on the detail as opposed to kind of doing that more empowering kind of stand back. I'm very happy to say, or I'm happy to say, I'm actually a bit of a workaholic. And what I'm finding is that given the pressure that our organization is under and the demands that are being placed on us, I am kind of tending to find that I am probably working too hard and on an unsustainable basis. We'll all be different. We'll all have our different kind of caricatures that we develop into. But I personally think the thing that I'm really trying to do really effectively at this point is to constantly, in a sense, look at myself and say, okay, am I becoming a caricature of myself? And I think one of the things that really resonates with me that Randall said is that effectively, I think as the senior leaders, particularly if you're the most senior leader in your team of your organization, is I do think you have a disproportionate influence on the organization at times of crisis for the reasons that Randall was talking about. And it feels to me particularly important, therefore, that if you are a senior leader, you really do think carefully about, am I turning into a caricature of myself? And actually, am I having a disproportionately negative impact on the organization? So the obvious question that I would expect you to then ask me is, okay, well, so, okay, if you hopefully, Chris, you know yourself well enough and you are beginning to become a caricature of yourself? What are you doing about it? So for me, I think as a senior leader, what I try to do with my team is I try to build an environment where the people who report to me and the team, immediate team that I lead, we have the kind of environment where I can get the feedback from my team when they're able. I've created an environment in which they can say, look, Chris, we think, obviously you're the leader. Obviously you need to provide us with the sense of direction that Randall was talking about, but actually we think you're getting this bit wrong. We'd like you to think about, do you need to do this, slightly differently? And I think for me, what we really need to do as senior leaders is give our teams the space and the environment in which they can feed back about if they think that you are becoming a caricature of yourself and that you need to do things differently. And I kind of recognize that when you're trying to move at pace and you're trying to provide that leadership that Randall talked about, that might feel like a bit of, overindulgence, that you simply haven't got time for it. But my argument would be that if we're going to be effective as organizations, and the organizations that we lead do what they need to do, you do need to get this balance between this obsessive, real drive and focus on the immediate task versus creating the reflective space to be able to step back as a team, to reflect on how well are you doing as a team, but also I think as a senior leader to enable your team to feed back to you about how well and effectively you're doing, so that if you are turning into a caricature of yourself, you can adjust your behavior. So let me just kind of make it really practical in terms of, what have I been doing this morning? A good conversation that was going on this morning is every fiber of my body was saying, look, we've got to get this press release out. This is the most important thing. We're having an interesting debate about whether these 3 or 4 paragraphs are actually in the right order and whether we've actually got the positioning absolutely right. And on the other hand, the team was saying, hey, look, to be frank, in the grand scheme of things, it's not massively important. I know you want to get all the detail right, Chris, but actually where we need to focus this morning is actually there's this team inside our organization that isn't quite working in the way that it should do at the moment. It's feeling a bit dislocated. What do we actually need to do to ensure that that team of 10 people is doing what they need to do? So for me, there was a real kind of classic illustration of where I knew that I was becoming in danger of becoming a bit of a caricature of myself by just focusing obsessively on the immediate task where we've got to get the press release out, we've got to ensure that it's perfectly drafted. But actually, on the other hand, what we really did need to do was really focus on ensuring that the team, that particular team, had the support that they needed. And my caricature of myself focused on the former when actually we needed to focus on the latter. And actually, thanks to the fact that we've created that environment where the team can feed back to me that actually this is what we need to focus on, hopefully I'm listening carefully enough, we did spend the time on the latter bit that we needed to. So I use that as an illustration, really, if I think that's the challenge that I feel. And again, we'll all be different. We'll all have, as I've said, the bits that we're better at and the bits that we know where we've got development needs. We'll all know the bits, hopefully, where we are in danger of becoming caricatures of ourselves. But my kind of sense is that as a senior leader, you've absolutely got to balance, as Randall said, that sense of clear, purposeful direction, so that the team that you lead are clear about what it is they're going to be doing. But equally, you've also got to be really alive to the fact that there is a danger that if you don't listen carefully, if you don't create that space for reflection, then there is a real danger that actually you're not leading in the organization, you're not leading the organization in the way that it needs to be led. And just a final thought, just as Randall kind of, I think, finished on resilience, I'd like to finish on resilience too, which is, if you asked me and said, Chris, so what's the thing that you find most difficult? I have to say, for me personally, it is that balance between, we have a fantastic opportunity at the moment as an organisation in terms of contributing, I think, to a really important debate about how the NHS, our National Health Service, is doing. The opportunity, I think, to kind of talk about lots of really interesting things about how the lessons that we're learning and what the NHS should do differently going forward. So it's what I describe as a fairly target-rich environment. There's a real opportunity to do lots and lots of work. But the bit I'm finding difficult is I would literally be working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because I love my job. I really enjoy it. I get a huge sense of fulfillment out of it, but I'm just finding it difficult to actually, how do I make sure that I'm working in a sustainable way? And that crucially, if I start trying to work 24/7, then actually by definition, I'm going to be unreasonably and inappropriately dragging my team along behind me in a way that really is not good as a senior leader. So my kind of sense is the bit that I need to constantly remind myself is I need to work sustainably. I need to role model the way in which that sustainable working should be done. And I need to ensure that I remember my responsibilities as the senior leader of the team to ensure that the organisation is working sustainably, and that I remember that it's my job to ensure that the health and well-being of all of my staff is, all of our staff is appropriately protected. But that's the bit I have to say, because I just love my job, I am probably finding the most difficult. I hope those observations are kind of helpful. They're quite personal, but I think sometimes actually we can have a really good quality of conversation if you talk about the personal.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Randall. We'll bring all three of us back now. I mean, let me just start on exactly where you finished there, Chris. I mean, we've been in lockdown in the UK for about 7 weeks, I guess. And obviously other countries slightly longer in many cases, slightly less long in others. I mean, the whole point, of course, is we don't know how long this is going to last. And, if someone had told us it's an 8-week lockdown, that would be far easier. Your point about sustainability, I think, is exactly right, which is that, we could be in some form of lockdown for literally 6 months. I mean, not completely, but this notion of trying to make this sustainable, what are your plans? I mean, are you going to literally take a few days of holiday? Are you going to try to find ways of essentially putting some sort of deputy into your role for a few days as a means of making sure that they've got the bandwidth and the skills to step up? What are your practical thoughts on that?
Well, no, that's a really good question, Julian. And to be frank, what we have done is, again, and I just would really commend this to everybody, is we've just had the real opportunity. We've taken the time out to have that discussion. And what we basically said is that we could be 24/7. We're not going to be. So we have a house rule, which effectively is you absolutely have to take a minimum of a complete day off a week, whatever happens. And that is rigidly observed. And then what we do is, and I'm incredibly lucky, I have a very, very talented deputy who effectively is able to substitute for me at any point, and I can substitute for her. And that, I think, makes a real difference. And I would, again, just commend that to people, which is, as a senior leader, your job is to grow the next generation of leaders. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity for them to step up. And then we're literally today in the middle of the debate of, so what do people's leave patterns look like for the next few weeks and months to ensure that we all get our appropriate share of leave. And then the other bit that we're doing is just really working out how, we haven't gone quite as formally as Blue Team and Green Team, as I know some other organisations have gone, but just really thinking about how do you organise the work and organise the team so that you do get an element of substitutability. But again, if you just focused on the task and you didn't think of all of that practical stuff, we wouldn't be doing that properly.
Indeed. Randall, your thoughts on the sustainability issue?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything Chris said, but I want to add just one or two other things here, which is that right now, as I talk to people, the main reaction is every day feels like every other day. Like it doesn't feel like weekday, weekend, because the physical pace of what we've done is gone. And that has potential advantage in maybe the day you take off, but it's important that you do take a few days off, or on Monday rather than Saturday, if Saturday is the day that you need cover somewhere else. And between you as a team, right, you can have pretty good coverage, but it has to, you have to coordinate it, and importantly, be flexible. And given that everybody's in their homes right now, that affords, and we don't have a centralized workplace we're all going to, that affords us a flexibility that actually we should take advantage of.
Got it. Thanks. So lots of questions of a variety of sort of levels. I'm going to start at the micro, and I'm going to bracket two questions together. One is, look, there's a big psychological impact on our staff of doing this sort of working from home. Speaking on mental health is particularly hard. Where do you start that conversation? And the sort of the paired question is how do you handle disagreements among employees when on lockdown? So I don't know if you see those as similar sorts of questions or separate, but the difficult conversations when you are physically remote. Any practical thoughts on how we start those?
Well, certainly on the mental health bit, given our health background, I think it's incredibly important. And one of the things that we've deliberately invested in as an organisation is really thinking quite carefully about how do we, before we went into lockdown, and actually ever since I've been the chief executive, and before that, we've really invested in trying to create the environment where it's a really important issue that we talk about on a regular basis. And I think having created that environment, what we now do is we deliberately seek opportunities in terms of, particularly through line management conversations, but also in terms of team meetings, to really specifically kind of ask people, how are you feeling? And I think you need to be sensitive about this. There are some environments in which people will be able to willing to talk about it in a team, a bit more in a team-based environment, but actually quite a lot of it is about really saying to your line managers, really identify where you've got worries and then make the phone call if you really have got a worry, and then make sure that there is appropriate support available if needed. So it just needs to be high up the list. And I think we all, again, I know what other people's experience was. We used to start every video conference call at the beginning with a kind of a deliberate 10 or 15 minutes. So how is everybody feeling? And I think that actually worked quite well for the first week, kind of 2 weeks, but actually after a while, people thought actually it wasn't working so effectively. And we've now therefore deliberately kind of using the line management route more effectively. In terms of the disagreements between employees, that is more difficult. But again, I think again, what you're looking for is line managers to play an appropriate role in doing that.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. Randall, some thoughts on that?
I again agree with what Chris is saying, but I would add just a couple of other things here. That is, importantly, is multi-channel. We tend to get used to, all of our meetings are on Zoom, so we're going to use Zoom. It's totally okay still to pick up a phone and call someone. Yeah. And a lot of the mental health check-ins and even a strong degree of conflict resolution should happen multi-channel, and not to be scared of that, or just like to break yourself out of a particular habit in terms of how you're working. And again, it's the supervisor thing. I do think that taking some time to have that conversation can be useful. A lot of organizations are, instead of taking 10 minutes at the beginning, they have a dedicated meeting. It's like having lunch together for an hour. Yeah. That works really well too. That can help people, just reality check how they're feeling with other people. And if there's a bit of time, do that as well.
And Julian, can I just jump in and just say, planned virtual social activity is, I think, a really good thing to do. So, for example, we ran our book club 2 or 3 weeks ago. We're having a virtual quiz tonight. We're doing a quiz night. And I would just make the observation that we find that really helpful. We're quite a small organisation and there is a family feel to it. But my kind of sense is that the clever thing to do is to really ask people to step up without it being too contrived, to actually do some planned virtual socializing, because I think that works really well. And there's a Friday night virtual Zoom drinks, for example, which again works well.
Got it. No, it's good advice. Question specifically for Randall, but obviously, Chris, you can comment as well. Randall, you said in one of your slides, clear, consistent, coherent messaging on the one hand, but inclusive and open on the other. And a couple of people are saying, there is some inherent contradiction there. How do we get that balance right between being decisive and being open to new ideas?
Look, I've been studying CEOs for 30 years. Every single one of them balances this, but they all do it in a little bit different way. It is really important both to be in touch with what's going on, being open to a really great idea when it happens across your desk, but at the same time, offering a sense of direction. People expect consistent and honest communication, but they will allow for the situation changes at some point, and now I am communicating something different. It's just you need to signpost, this is what's happened, and now we need to move in that direction over there.
Got it. And I'm going to ask a slightly different question. Chris, pick up this one first maybe. How can we be transparent without demoralizing our employees when the news is actually pretty grim. I mean, there's lots, I'm not saying NHS necessarily, but many organizations are laying people off. They are literally having to go through cuts. And there's a huge challenge there, isn't there?
But there is a huge challenge. And, I've been in environments where, not in the current crisis, where, doing that communications of communicating to people about some really difficult messages is very important. And I think the lessons that I picked up from that, I think apply just as relevantly now, which is please recognize that, you need to communicate openly and honestly. And my sense is that the communications go wrong when people are trying to either hide things in a way they ought not to be hiding, and they try and sort of get very circumlocutory. In other words, they go round and round, and actually they just end up confusing people. And I think the reality is that we owe it to our teams to be honest and open and clear about what is happening, even if it is good news. And my observation would be we need to spend quite a lot of time as senior leaders thinking through exactly how we are going to do that communication. And again, I just loved Randall's, you can never over communicate, and you certainly can never over communicate honestly. And that's what, those are my watchwords, would be my watchwords about what how to do that.
Good. Randall, a slightly different question for you, and feel free to challenge the premise of the question. The research seems to indicate a more masculine and extroverted type of leader is sought during a crisis. How will this impact the leadership styles in the future? Will it erode progress made in terms of diversity and inclusion in the boardrooms? Okay.
An excellent question. I would like to just say one other thing in addition to the question you asked, Chris, though, if you don't mind.
Okay, that's fine. Go on.
It's the importance of communicating a shared future, and always remember that the best predictor of how the people are going to feel who stay is how you treat the people who leave. Yeah. So do not, try to, pull a fast one or just do it quickly and treat them badly. It will backfire on you badly. Yeah. And I think it's important that I
very good. So can you still remember the question I asked you as well? Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great point. And it's something that I've thought a lot about. I think that in that balance between understanding what's happening at the bottom levels of an organization and having the ability to be assertive and communicate strongly, the communicate strongly is clearly more masculine in gender stereotyping, but I would argue the other one was more feminine stereotyping. And I don't think in the end that it means that we should go backwards in any way on the progress we've made in terms of diversity. What I would suggest is men and women, for example, may want to work on different angles here. If the instinct as a man is to just jump right into, lean forward and be uber masculine, you need to say, hold on, there's another side to it here. If you become out of touch with what's going on in the organization, you lose traction and relevance, and people won't respond to it anymore. And you need to focus on some of those other things. So, and vice versa. So I think both parties, men and women, for example, have something to work on here.
So Julian, can I just jump in? And I think, the question was rightly about diversity and inclusion. And I think my argument would be that we need to think of the leadership task here as a collective one. And that if you're talking about our organization, there is a broad senior leadership team. And I think one of the things I'm very proud of is the way in which we have created a diverse leadership a diverse set of leadership styles, in a sense, in which we've got, my deputy is female. I think she's absolutely brilliant at some things I'm dreadful at. And actually, it's the fact that we've got a broader leadership team that is able to do things in a number of different ways and can draw on all of our collective strengths that actually means, I think, certainly our staff tell us, that the organisation is very well led. My argument would be that's precisely because we've created a broad and rounded leadership team, and we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about how do you get that diversity of leadership as part of a broader senior team.
Good. So, question here about the feeling of being left behind. I mean, in a crisis, the leadership team will often kind of move move ahead. They're doing lots of good stuff, and a lot of people feel that they haven't been communicated with. That is a very common syndrome. Do you have any advice for some of the people who find themselves in that position? In other words, they've got lots of bright ideas. They can see things that should be being done. They want to help, and they feel that somehow their leaders are too busy to even listen. Any helpful thoughts for those people who are feeling a little bit left behind?
After you, Randall.
Oh, no. Well, I was going to say, I remember in Kathleen's, in this series, she talked a lot about that. So if that's something that really interests you, she had some really good things to say. But for my money, in terms of paraphrasing that, from a follower point of view, don't be scared to make suggestions, to put things forward. Your instinct is to put that tape over your own mouth. Yeah. Sometimes. Don't do it. Do keep talking, do keep suggesting. If you see a great idea, and no, not everyone's always going to be taken, but it'll be helpful to the organization if they know what you're thinking, and request the updates. Most leaders aren't trying to do this purposefully and exclude. They get so busy, there's so much to do that they sometimes forget the kind of core basic of communicate in a crisis. That's the number one.
Yeah, and I think that's great, Randall. I completely agree with that. And I think then by definition that puts a responsibility on the leaders to create an environment in which people are able to make that contribution. And my argument, I think Julian, you and both of you put it really well, which is the real danger, it feels to me, is you're so focused on getting through stuff at real speed that you simply, even if people are waving at you and saying, "Oi, I want to contribute, I want to make it," you're just too focused on the immediate task. And that's why I think getting that balance between task, individual and team is so vital. And I can absolutely see that if leaders aren't getting that balance right, then people can get disempowered and ignored, and actually that can really, really adversely impact on the effectiveness of the organization. So as well as there being a follower responsibility here, and again, you had it in your slides, Randall, I think there's also a leader responsibility to create an environment in which those followers can be heard.
Good. Thank you. So I've had a lot of questions about what role models you would like to mention. These can be individual leaders or can be organizations that have done well through this crisis. And these can be corporations or they can be national governments. I really don't mind, but I've had so many questions along these lines, I feel compelled to ask. So who wants to...
One that I would mention, it got a lot of press, is Greg Foran, who's the CEO of Air New Zealand. And you think, what is he, Air New Zealand? Just watch a video of him talk about the crisis, what it means for Air New Zealand, what it means for the nation. And it's fantastic. And I would dare anybody to say that isn't a good role model for most any industry about how to communicate with people.
Got it. Thanks. I have not seen that, but I will. Chris?
It's interesting. I was slightly thinking, what am I going to say? And it's really interesting. Randall's use of the word New Zealand. Actually, I think Jacinta Ardern has done an absolutely fantastic job as the national leader of her country. And why do I say that? I think two or three things is, I think she's been incredibly honest and clear in her communications, and she set out in a really open and detailed way about some of the dilemmas that I think national governments face in this crisis. And I just really admire also the way in which she has been. She's done the media work that she's done, where she's communicated incredibly effectively in a way that has inspired significant massive amounts of confidence across her nation. So, and there are, I think she's done a really amazing job of that. So she'd be somebody who, given that we tend to work in a slightly more political world, when I look around, I think of the national leaders I've seen, I think she's been very impressive.
Good, thanks. So I want to just tiptoe gently into the political kind of space here. There's this thing called the rally round the flag effect, which we're all familiar with. This is this notion that we want to believe that our leaders are doing a good job, but at the same time, when we don't feel they are doing a good job, to what extent should we be actually openly criticizing and challenging them? And again, this is a question you can take at the political or national level or at a sort of a corporate level. Does either of you want to have a go at this?
Well, I'm very happy to have a go, and I think it's a very, very acute and difficult question for us, because we feel that on the one hand, as the membership organisation that represents the 217 trusts, we're part of one NHS team, and we feel there's a significant responsibility on us to communicate to our country and our citizens about what the NHS is trying to do. Equally, though, the role that we have played in the past is that we have been deliberately, and quite rightly in my view, our role has been to point up where our political leaders are failing the NHS. And if I'm honest, the way we describe it in the office is we feel ourselves on a bit of a tightrope, which is that on the one hand, we want to be part of one NHS team, but equally, inevitably, there are some things that we think aren't kind of going as well as they should be. And the bit that worries me about Rally Around the Flag is that I've always been a great pluralist. I believe that you get the right answer by seeking different views and effectively then synthesizing them into the right answer. What worries me about Rally Around the Flag is that you don't get that range of views. And I think, for example, classic question in the UK is, or in any country, is what role does the opposition political parties kind of play? I think they face the same dilemma, and you can absolutely kind of look at about the way that they're entering this debate. So my view is that I do think it's important there should be, on the one hand, a sense of a united nation, trying to address a really difficult challenge. But I think the best way we get there is by having an appropriately robust, rigorous, evidence-based debate.
And before, Randall, I'm going to get you in a second, but just a quick follow-up to Chris. I mean, you've been very visible in the last 7 or 8 weeks. And some of the NHS, well, I guess I haven't seen many of the NHS leaders of the individual trusts visible in the media. Is that a deliberate decision that you are, as it were, spokesperson for the whole NHS?
Well, so a combination of two things, really, which is understandably in many senses, when you get into these crises, then the NHS does want a single unified message. And therefore there is, if you actually formally work inside the NHS as a trust chief executive, there is a not a requirement, it's probably too strong a sense, but there is, when you get into crisis, there is a formal approach, which inevitably communications are focused on at the top of the organisation. The role that we've always played is that we have been the voice of those trusts. We've got ourselves into a happy position whereby those at the top of the NHS do trust what we say. They recognise that we've got an important role to play in terms of filling the gap between the very, very top level stuff that's done at the Downing Street, the Prime Minister's press conferences, and then all of the frontline testimony, which is often very distressing, and quite rightly so. Actually, what we've tried to do is explain the bit in the middle, and that's the bit where I think we do have a very important role to play. And in a sense, our trust chief executives are happy to leave that to mostly to us, and I think that hopefully then works. What we feel is that you just need a rational, evidence-based voice out there that explains in detail what the NHS is really trying to do, and that's the gap we're seeking to fill.
Perfect. Randall, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Rally Around the Flag effect is exactly what I was talking about, in the political sphere, where people become more conforming, we look to the top, and we narrow our way of thinking. And for me, I completely agree with Chris. We need an evidence-based discussion, and we need to hear a lot of voices. I think, objecting verbally, making your point, participating in a conversation, and even sometimes just saying, I think it's wrong, I 100% fully support. I think for me, the line is when the behavior starts to, for example, put other people at risk. It's one thing to say, we don't think, this way of social isolation is right. It's another thing to call a rally and have people, wandering around taking no precautions, right? Because they put a lot of others at risk.
Yeah.
And for me, that's the distinction and the important line here.
Perfect. So a final question, and it's looking to the future. Thank you very much, Chris and Randall. Any thoughts on how to lead forward post-crisis when the organisations will be pulled back to some degree to the known? So, let's be optimistic. Let's, imagine that point when we are allowed back to some sort of version of what we saw before. Will our leadership styles have to change again? Are there things we can learn and take forward in a more normal world in the future?
Well, I'd just give you one thought, really, which is that all of us in the NHS are incredibly proud of some of the things that we have done over the last 8 to 10 weeks. The speed with which we've transformed, the service, the speed with which, for example, we put things online. To be frank, the degree of permissiveness that's been given both to trust chief executives and their staff to just get on and do stuff. And the bit that I would hold up as the shining opportunity is the opportunity to take some of those innovations and those different ways of doing things and build a much better and more effective national health service. So the bit that I would be profoundly depressed by is if we went back to doing exactly what we were doing before. The $6 million question is, as we move back to a sort of normal, how do we create a new normal that it takes advantage of that fantastic innovation that's been done? And that, for me, is a really key challenge that all of us as leaders over the next few months need to take full advantage of.
Good. Randall, any last thoughts?
Yeah, a couple things. One of which is, of course, even before this, we were talking about a VUCA world, where the world is more volatile.
Yeah, we didn't know.
A certain degree of this seems to be endemic now, and it is our world. So some of it will never go back to what we thought we knew 20 years ago. You know, the world really has moved on. And secondly, I would say, I hope you have a few people, really smart people, planning that future right now. Every organization dedicated to planning that future, because that's the way we're going to make that happen and make it happen as painlessly as possible.
No, thank you. So look, we will close there. We are right out of time. So really, really fascinating for me to listen to these conversations and to bring it so much into the public debate that's been going on in the UK anyway. We are going to close now. If we could get that final slide up, in case any of you are interested, we had more than 100 questions, some very, very complimentary about today's conversation. We had more than 1,200 people on the call. Before we finish, I just want to introduce you to the next of our webinars. How is the economic and political system adapting to lockdown? Richard Portis is a professor of economics, a real expert on the financial and economic issues. Elias Papaianu, is going to be talking to us a little bit about some of the challenges of the rise of populism and how that is affecting the political environment. So should be a fascinating session. That'll be midday on Thursday. So without further ado, I'm just going to say once again, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Randall, for a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for listening, and we will look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Thanks and goodbye.